For the rest, the session three, I'll talk about the food revolution in the 18th century and the agricultural revolution from a long perspective. The spread of new crops in the 16th and 17th centuries gradually changed people's diets and daily lives. However, such changes always faced resistance from existing crops and long-established eating habits. For example, in Europe, the potato was once despised, and in China, maize was also looked down upon. But eventually, these new crops spread and took root in new regions. By the 18th century, they had secured their places. And these new crops became essential for population growth. That is important. Because global population increased in part due to the greater food supply made possible by them. For the world, maize and potatoes from the New World are the perfect examples of this transformation. And this scene depicts Columbus arriving back to Europe in 1493 and handing over corn or maize at the harbor, symbolizing the moment when maize, a new world crop, was first brought into European civilization. Yeah, so um, yeah, compared to 1492, arriving at the eastern part of the um of America, the next year, 1493, is more important in terms of like exchanging products or like from brothers like perspective. And after maize was introduced to Europe, it spread gradually and eventually came to be cultivated across the continent. Its success was remarkable, yet interestingly, maize never became a preferred food among the wealth. Among the wealth, for the upper classes, maize had little prestige. It was seen as inferior food. But because of its very high productivity, maize quickly became the staple of the common people. When hunger is reality, food taboos disappear. It's according to Broder's expression, or Broder says like this. But we know that by instincts, right? Um, yeah, when we feel hunger, we're like, yeah, hunger makes in our phrases like uh, uh the uh like we can eat a horse, right? Starvation makes people eat everything, right? Including all, yeah, people itself, humanity. Anyway, here is the key points Broad emphasizes. By feeding themselves primarily on maize, the cheaper grain, pigeons were able to sell their wheat on the market, often for twice the price. So this meant that the maize indirectly enabled the commercialization of wheat in some regions for the loss. Potatoes, sorry, maize makes wheat like more for the rich because of they could avoid starvation because of the maize. So yeah, we can summarize Broder's um, discussion like this. Maize fed people, wheat enriched the market. In some ways, an even more important crop than maize was the potato. Potatoes had originally been widely cultivated since around the second millennium BC in the highlands of the Andes in America, regions where maize could not grow well and higher level. Yeah, that's the weak points of the maize, and it's in certain areas, especially in mountain areas. But potatoes, uh, yeah, yeah, was there. So when the potato crossed the Atlantic and arrived in Europe, it actually achieved even greater success there. By the late 18th and 17th centuries, potatoes had firmly established themselves in Europe agriculture and came to dominate diets across the continent. The German economist Wilhelm Reich even argued that the potato was the primary cause of Europe's population boom. Yeah, potato did a good role in making European population grow rapidly. Yeah, indeed, potatoes rapidly spread rapidly by the early 17th century. They had already been introduced to Ireland. In the 18th century, potatoes became almost the soul food source for Irish people, Irish peasants, especially peasants. Their staple diet consisted essentially of dairy products and potatoes. However, behind this agricultural success lies a horrifying tragedy. Brodel doesn't go into much detail here, but the context is important. Ireland experienced several famines in the 18th century and 19th centuries, and the most devastating one, known as the Great Irish Famine, unfolded in the mid 19th century. Uh, this is the famous depiction of the Irish famine by Lillian Lucy Davison, 1946. And during this period, over 1 million people died, and the famine triggered mass migration to the United States. Scholars explained that the devastation was so severe because the Irish diet had become heavily dependent on potatoes. When potatoes blight, the disease struck, potato yields collapsed, and widespread starvation followed. It is often said that the disaster was due to reliance on a single variety, the lump of potatoes, as I showed, like this. But in fact, the blight would have affected any potato strain. The deeper issue was extreme dependence on a single crop. Why did the Irish rely so much on potatoes? Because compared to wheat, potatoes could feed roughly twice as many people per acre. Another another reason the Irish came to rely so heavily on potatoes was that potatoes were relatively safe from war. Even during military conflicts, potatoes continued to grow underground, largely untouched. So in times of war, when fields were burned or livestock taken, potatoes still. survive underground, of course. In fact, some historians suggest that war itself encouraged potato cultivation since it afforded a kind of insurance crop. Yeah, that's interesting. There was yet another major advantage. Potato cultivation was exempt from the tithe. Do you know what it is, tithe? The church tax on agricultural products. We have historical records indicating this, but Broder does not go into detail about why potatoes were exempt. But one reasonable inference is that potatoes were considered a poor man's crop, and taxing them might have been seen as burdening the most vulnerable pigeons. In short, potatoes were cheap, productive, or resilient in wartime, and even tax-free, a perfect recipe for mass adoption. Yeah, that's funny, right? So by the end of the 18th century, the so-called food revolution had basically reached completion over the next 2 centuries. Because in the 21st century, people do not starve because there is not enough food. They starve for social, legal, and moral reasons, not because the earth cannot produce enough. In fact, sometimes food is thrown away or even dumped into the ocean, not because people don't need it, but because the cost of transporting it to places like Africa is higher than the value of the food itself. Brothers does not explicitly make this point, but it helps us understand the modern situation. There are definitely there are many people who in a starved situation as of right now, but we have food in other regions, right? Anyway, in that sense, the total amount of food, if we yeah, we cannot deny um the presence of people starving, but yeah, we could give them the rest of food, the food. Yeah, we could feed them, but we need some expense transporting the food. Anyway, it's sad, right? So the starvation of that those people, it's not because of uh the natural or like agricultural problem, but because um we are not willing to feed them. Anyway, so when we talk about the 18th century food revolution, we need to think in a broader or macro perspective. It is really part of a larger or longer agricultural revolution. In my view, Broder's discussion of the agricultural revolution is not always completely clear or simple. However, he does offer a very important historical perspective. He does not explain history in a simple single line narrative like tracing one timeline step by step. Instead, he compares different regions and different people around the world, showing both diachrony and synchrony. Diachrony or the diachronicity meaning changes over time, And synchrony or synchronicity means the differences that exist at the same time across different places. This is one of Broder's strengths. He helps us to see he helps us see history not as one straight line, but as a global picture with multiple readings and multiple layers. So when Brodel discusses the agricultural revolution, it looks at two types of human society. And the first one is the people with holes, those who actively developed material civilization, cultivated land, spread new crops, and drove agricultural changes. And second, people who remained outside that process, what he sometimes calls native or primitive groups in a descriptive historical sense, including societies not yet deeply engaged in settled farming. In other words, for Broda, the agricultural revolution was not a single event or uniform transformation. It was a long, uneven, and global process shaped both by those pushing agricultural development forward and by those who stood apart from it. So, um, of what is the key ideas behind the agricultural revolution in terms of dominant crops and human society? We often think there is a dominant crop and people simply adjust themselves to it. This sounds like a kind of true determinism or even crop determinism, as if the plant controls human history. But Brodel argues the opposite. For him, for Brodel, the change in dominant crops, the rise of a particular plant, is not the cause, but the result of human action. In other words, it is not that plants shape people first, rather, people who adapt to their environment, who innovate, who experiment, and who work to improve their farming systems are the ones who turn a crop into a dominant crop. They do not just accept a plant as it is, they improve it, spread it, and elevate it until it becomes central to society. And the classic examples, as we saw, are maize and the potato. Um, the potatoes, which exist in only 5 or 6 varieties in the Americas, has today multiplied into more than 1,000 different types. Likewise, the wild maize of the pre-Columbian period has been so transformed that it is almost unrecognizable compared to the corn now produced in the American corn belt. It has been selectively bred, diversified, and industrialized to an extraordinary degree. Brodel therefore argues that this is not a simple a botanical or biological success, but primarily a cultural success. This is important, I think. Yeah, it could be like the question for the final exam. Yeah, I mentioned that. He calls this process a kind of weaving technology, a metaphor for how human societies weave plants into their economic and cultural systems. In other words, even dominant crops such as corn, maize, and potatoes rose to prominence through competition and social elevation. Yeah, that's interesting. And who made this success possible? not the plants themselves, but what Broder calls instrumental humans, Homo faber in Latin, or people with hoes. These were the agents of agricultural change, the ones who experimented, cultivated, and spread these crops across regions and centuries. So this is a map I showed earlier, but here it is a more simplified form. It it, it illustrates the distribution of people with holes. In other words, human communities that practice settled or semi-settled agriculture. The movement and spread of new crops and the competition between old and new crops would not have been possible without these agricultural pioneers. Those who used hoes, planted, experimented, and cultivated the land. So when we look beyond the regions we are almost familiar with and consider the groups we often refer to as native or primitive people, we can distinguish between communities that use agricultural tools like hoes and those that did not. Of course, these are exceptions. There are exceptions. Some island societies, such as the people of Tahiti, had well-developed cultures and social norms even without intensive agriculture. At the same time, there were also truly primitive groups in the sense that they lived primarily by hunting and gathering, far removed from farming or tool-based cultivation. In this sense, Broder's conception of an agricultural revolution contains two dimensions. Yeah, first, a diachronic dimension, a change of time, and this is typically the main focus of historians, how things evolve gradually through ups and downs across long periods. Second, a synchronic dimension, diversity across space at the same moment in time. This is closer to the sociological perspective. At any given period, different regions and societies can be at very different stages of development. To put it simply, the agricultural revolution was not a single moment or a sudden event. It emerges slowly over centuries throughout the introduction of new crops and the persistent labor and innovation of human communities. Yet, even during this process, there were places living in a primitive agricultural condition, while others were already advancing with highly developed farming techniques. Different worlds coexisted at the same time. So when Brodel speaks of the people with hoes, he means those who actively embraced new crops, helped spread them, and pushed forward agricultural development. They were agents of change in this long and even uneven transformation. All right, with this, we conclude and we have now worked through the chapter two of Brodell's book. Of course, following the lecture notes and understanding the content this way is useful. However, whenever possible, I encourage you to read the textbook yourselves. This is That is always the deeper learning. And let me emphasize once again, don't stop at simply memorizing or summarizing information. When I pose questions during class, or when I point out broadest problems and limitations, I hope you listen carefully. You should also be asking your own questions. What issues am I noticing? How far does broadest argument really hold? Where might be where might be Where might it be incomplete or insufficient? Developing your own critical perspective is the goal in this class. All right. Well done again this week. I hope you have a restful and meaningful weekend. And that'll be all for today's class. Thank you. Bye. See you next week. And we for the next class that should be in-person class. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Bye.